Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan and I'm joined by Steve Keen, who's an honorary professor at the University College London, or UCL, and a critic of the economic mainstream. Steve, welcome back to interest.co.nz. We last spoke in April of 2020 when COVID-19 was still something quite new and we were all sort of working out what it was going to mean. Just really keen to catch up and chat about how you're seeing the world now, 18 months or so down the line. I mean, COVID is showing no sign of going away, is it?
Well, yeah, I mean, an evolutionary foe only goes away if you wipe it out. What we've instead done is put evolutionary pressure on it to change its form and become harder to eradicate. And I've just actually read a satirical blog by a virologist saying that if you actually wanted to generate a dangerous threat to humanity, the best thing you could do is what we've done over the last 18 months, with the very rare exceptions of countries like New Zealand and Taiwan. And so it's not going to go away. We could have eradicated it if we'd had a strict New Zealand-style lockdown for every country in the world for 6 to 12 weeks. It would have been gone. It would have been a past event in history. Instead, we've had it for it's now coming up to 18 months, actually more than 18, coming up to 2 years. And we still don't know whether it's going to be, people think just the flu. One thing about just the flu is you have it and you get over the flu, you don't have any continuing symptoms from the flu after you've recovered. We still don't know whether this is this generation's polio, but it's looking like for a substantial fraction of those people who get it, it is something which is long-term debilitating. So even if we do manage to eradicate it at some point, we're going to have something close to 20% of those who get it having ongoing health issues for the rest of their lives.
So obviously it's a huge problem still, and the health ramifications, as you say, we're still learning about them, I guess, every day, every week as it goes on. What about from an economic perspective? How do you think governments and people around the world are coping on that front?
Well, the crazy thing is that economics policy is dominated by neoclassical economic theory, and that is there's always anti-government spending and anti-running a deficit for reasons which are categorically wrong, but make sense within a neoclassical framework. But what happens when a crisis hits is that neoclassical thing's chucked out the window. If you go back to the financial crisis back in 2007, 2008, one thing which Hank Paulson had to say about the American government was that the attitude all the top officials had, including Bush at the time, was they weren't going to let capitalism fail on their watch. So they threw everything they could at the government at it. Well, the same thing has happened this time around. Countries which said you can't run a deficit have run deficits of 30% of GDP. Now, that has reduced the damages from climate change, from COVID dramatically, because without that, capitalism would have collapsed. If you still had to pay your rent, still had to pay your mortgage, and no one was able to go shopping and you had no cash flow, then most companies would have failed and most banks would have failed. So we needed a government rescue, and it has happened to some degree, but it's been constrained by this worry about, we can't have too much of a deficit, that's bad for the economy in the future, that's a burden on our grandchildren. That's nonsense. But that belief has restrained the level of government spending below what it could have been, and that's one reason why in many countries lockdowns haven't worked, because if you have two choices, you might get a disease or you will be evicted from your home. Then what will happen is what governs what you do, and people go to work regardless, and you spread the disease even more. So there's been some government rescue of the economy and the effects of COVID, but not as much as they could have done.
So when you look out now at where we are, obviously vaccine rollouts in some countries are quite significant now. I mean, you'll obviously be well aware of what's going on in your native Australia, what's going on in the UK. As we look ahead, I mean, where do you see things going over the next, I guess, 6, 12, 18 months?
Well, if you look at the UK as the interesting case, because they have a vaccination rate approaching 70% of the population's double vaccinated, And they've still got a bubble effectively going on in the number of people getting COVID. They're still in one of their rising peak periods. In fact, it's the second largest peak they've had, I think. So this disease is so much more contagious that 70% is not enough. And I've seen estimates from virologists that you need about 90% vaccinated, and that's 90% of the population. That includes children. 90% vaccinated to actually stop the transmission link. Now that means because we're opening up at 70, we're going to continue getting outbreaks, and then when the outbreaks happen, you have to isolate, because with the Delta variant, if one person gets it, and then all their close contacts will get it. So we've seen 100% family infection rates occurring when somebody gets COVID and the family goes home, whether that's a child or an adult, and passes it on. So this is going to mean continuous interruptions to the economy. And the first thing that happened in the UK was shelf shock, because there'd be people stacking shelves at a supermarket. One of them would have COVID, pass it on to everybody else stacking shelves that night. All the shelf stackers are therefore off work for at least 2 weeks, seeing whether they have serious symptoms, and the supermarkets are empty. So this is going to continue pushing the economy from down deep. It'll come up when the surge diminishes with the next stage of lockdowns and so on, light lockdowns, and then when you loosen once again, the cases will rise once more, and you'll have the same effect. So I see this as a series of booms and slumps in the economic data, but overall, the overall trend is probably flatlining to falling, because what this is doing is disrupting the global supply chains we have. I've just seen a piece today that Toyota is reducing its production this month by 40% because of one case of COVID in a Vietnamese factory.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the supply chain issue actually next. You've segued nicely into that. I mean, obviously, this is something we've heard more and more about, and I don't know, probably going back 8-9 months now. All these empty containers being sent around the world, and there not being enough of them in China, etc. And obviously, concerns about inflation have risen in recent months too. So, what's your take on how the I guess the supply chain issues play out, and are you actually worried about inflation at the moment?
On the supply chain, I think this is showing that the fragility of globalisation. Because globalisation was done, for the profit interest of the owners of American corporations. Fundamentally, they were quite happy to shift their production from the Midwest of America across to China, screw the workers, and make a larger rate of profit, even though they had to hand over half the ownership of the Chinese firms they established to a Chinese partner, which is where Chinese capitalism has come from. But what that meant was that combined with just-in-time warehousing meant that you first of all, you had, like in the case in the Apple iPhone, there's over 100 components from over 100 countries, factories in 100 different countries in each iPhone. So one outbreak anywhere is going to break that whole chain. And then with just-in-time, you don't have much in the way of inventory on hand in case there's a disruption. So it means production is incredibly fragile. And this is one point where I strongly agree with Nassim Taleb, that we should have an anti-fragile system, not one that is easily broken down. To be robust, you have to have buffers. And that means you have to have short supply chains, and you have to have stocks on hand so that if there's a disruption to the supply chain, you can continue producing while you work out how to get around that disruption. So I think what COVID is going to do is force production back on shore. And that's going to be extremely difficult for countries that have outsourced that production because they've lost the skill set. And America, of course, is the classic example of that, but Australia, New Zealand, the UK, not a lot of Europe. A lot of Europe has still maintained its manufacturing base. But the Anglo-Saxon countries, which fell for this neoclassical garbage more than the rest of the world did, are going to find it very, very hard to re-establish industries they've outsourced.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to go down that route, that there's a heck of a lot involved there, and I imagine it would take a long time. So, I mean, if we really started, say in New Zealand or Australia, started to try and bring things back today, how long do you think it would take, and would we get there before the pandemic was even over?
It'd take of the order of a decade. I mean, for a start, you haven't got the engineers you need, so you've got to train them. And you probably haven't got the staff to train them, so you've got to, if you can import academics from the rest of the world who can teach the engineering, then you have to, there's the machine tool training you need as well. You've got to build the capacity to make the machine tools. This is a decade-long program. Now, China did that very effectively. I was in China in 1981 or 91. I'm getting my decades running out. Yeah, but I think it was 1991, 92. And that was when the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone was being established. And we went through a few factories before we got there, including light bulb manufacturing factories, for example. And they were still assembling light bulbs by hand. You screw the glass on top, evacuate it through a pump, pass it on to the next person, and so on. Now the machine tools do all that. So they took them about a decade, from 1992, when that free trade zone opened, to about 2002 before we started taking Chinese manufacturing seriously. So a similar thing, it'll take you a decade to build back the manufacturing capability you've lost over the last 4 decades.
And that, I guess, assumes that there's the political will and the public will to actually do it. Yeah,
and at the moment there isn't. I mean, economists will continue advising against, because, comparative advantage, which is the greatest load of cod swallop in economic history, but swallowed by most neoclassical economists. What actually promotes growth is having a diversified industrial structure. That's been empirically shown by work by both Danny Roderick, but also two institutes, both calling themselves the Atlas of Economic Complexity. And what actually enables you to grow is having a range of industries that effectively you can sort of combine into a new industry. My favorite example there is sailboards, which combines sailing with surfboards. And you have to have both manufacturers in your own country before it's feasible to even consider inventing a sailboard. Once you do, spin-offs from that. That's that sort of approach to growing over time. So that'll be resisted by the economists, particularly in places like Treasury and the central bank. And the public itself has lost that experience of working in factories, doing design, engineering design. And as Elon Musk emphasizes, making the machine that makes the machine is far harder than designing the machine in the first instance. So all these things are going to be extremely difficult. And when it comes to some products where you simply can't imagine doing the design yourself, then we'd need to get to the stage where people are willing to sell designs rather than sell products. And that is, it's a world we've never lived in, and it won't be easy to make that transition, but I think it will be necessary.
What about inflation? There's obviously been a bit of a debate going on in recent months about, are we going to have major inflation issues like the 1970s again, or is this just a blip because of the supply chain issues due to COVID? What's your take on this?
Bit of both. I mean, certainly I see it as a blip, because if you have a sudden collapse in supply, and some of the classic examples there, for example, with timber in America, which for a while the supplies collapsed, and you had a huge increase in prices. Then you had production coming back online again, and the collapse went out of the way. Semiconductors were in short supply when Taiwan had a drought, because water is a major element in the manufacturing of semiconductors. Without the water supply, they couldn't make the semiconductors. So car manufacturers and fridge manufacturers had to stop production lines, and you had a higher cost of inputs for the firms, so they passed that cost on through a markup. And you also had competition, people who wanted to have them bidding up the prices. But what you don't have that we had back in the 1970s is a momentum from the demand side of the economy to continue that process on. Because we had supply shocks in the 1970s, the first oil crisis after the Yom Kippur War, when the boycott of any country that supported Israel meant oil prices increased from $2.50 a barrel to $10. And then in 79, 80, you had another fourfold increase from $10 to $40 a barrel. Now, in the first instance, that's what gave us the big inflationary spike in 1973, 74. But that was maintained because you had full employment, strong unions, and after a credit collapse, there was a housing boom fairly much globally, driven by credit. After that slump turned around, then you had workers demanding wage rises, which then fed back into the supply shock, and you got a continuation. And banks were willing to lend, even though after the initial credit slump there was a slump for a while. Banks were back into lending again. So if a firm had to put up its prices, it could do that, and it could borrow the money necessary to pay the higher prices for suppliers, and then put up its own prices to cover its cash flow. So you had all these feed-through effects. They're not going to apply this time around because we have so much higher level of private debt that credit for the purposes of expansion is not going to happen. Credit because you're forced to borrow since you have commitments you can't reach for in your cash flow, that's risen, but you're not going to get demand driving. You've destroyed the union movement. There's no capacity for workers to be organised anymore. You may get a short inflationary spike in wages when you have a shortage of supply of labour, which is happening in some parts of America now, and that will mean employers offer higher wages to get workers from other firms. But overall, the continuation won't be there. What I think is more likely is simply a collapse in demand, in the sense that people who are what used to be a mass consumer item will cease being a mass consumer item. The price increase will push people out of that market segment. So, for example, one of the obvious ones is international air flights, and they're cheap as chips for the last 10 years. Anybody can decide to go on an international holiday, pretty much. Now, if the supply price increase in air travel prices come through, it'll go back to being a luxury item, and so you'll still see an increase in the price, but the percentage of the consumer price index basket that product makes up will go down. So for that reason, I don't expect sustained inflation. What I expect is a collapse in demand, meaning many things we've taken for granted as a mass consumer item will cease being mass consumer items. And that won't go down very well for people who've got used to a comfortable lifestyle involving an international holiday every year, a new car every 5 years, etc., etc.
Well, look, Steve, I think probably a good point at which to wrap this up. Look, I really appreciate your time. It's Steve Keen, who's Honorary Professor at the University College of London and a critic of the economic mainstream. Appreciate your time. Good to chat again. And I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.
Before we turn out, though, I just actually want to let you know that I'll be speaking in New Zealand, so physically, not physically, of course, but virtually. And I think it's going to be Monday, the 20th of September. And that's being organised. I haven't got the data in my diary, I'm afraid to say. I'm being slack on this front. But on the 20th of September, there'll be a seminar organised by Dougal McTavish, and it'll involve myself and a few other speakers, including Susan Kendrick. So it should be, people can sign up to that. I'll put that notice up on my Patreon blog.
Okay, great.